أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد والثناء لله رب العالمين نحمده ونستعينه ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين صلوات الله. أوصيكم بتقوى الله واتباع أمره. I begin this khutbah as we begin all of our khutab with an admonishment to you and also a reminder for myself that we foster taqwa, constant fear of God, consciousness of God. Always keep Him in mind, especially during our fast. This is one of the tools that we have at our disposal to be able to remember Him as we feel the pangs of hunger, the thirst. That we should also remember Allah who has asked us to do this, and Allah who will give us thirst and hunger on the Day of Judgment as well, as part of the trials of that day. This month of Ramadan is one of the nicknames of the month, one of the titles of the month is Rabi'ul Quran. It's a spring of the Quran. It's a time where we try to reconnect with Quran in different ways. Many of us try to read more Quran, maybe try to complete a whole cycle or more. And I think this is one of those red sulfurs of our life. We're always trying to connect with Quran better. And it seems like, especially as Shia, we go through our whole lives and we're at the end of our life and we always say, I wish I knew Quran more. I always wanted to learn Arabic. I wish I understood more. And it's always this thing over the horizon that we never quite get to. And it's really a shame. We shouldn't go through our lives like this. If we're followers of Ahlul Bayt, we're followers of Thaqalain, we can't just grab onto one Thaqal and leave the other. And that is typically what Shia do. They take Ahlul Bayt and they think that by attending majalis, that they've done their duty, not realizing that they've said Hasbuna Ahlul Bayt. They criticize the other ones for saying Hasbuna Kitabullah and leaving Ahlul Bayt. But we may not have done anything better by taking one and leaving the other. And neither one is sufficient. It's ma in tamassaktum bihima. As long as you hold fast to both of them, lan tadillu. You won't fall into misguidance. But if we suffice ourselves with either one, whether it's Kitabullah, whether it's Itratul Nabi, we are lost. Right? So we have to see the double standard in that and not think that somehow we're excused because we have Ahlul Bayt. If we've abandoned Quran, then we're no better than the others. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa Let me begin by sharing a couple of hadith with you. We have a whole book of Al-Kafi. Within Al-Kafi, one of the 35 books of Al-Kafi is Kitab Fadl al-Quran. It's on the virtues of the Quran, and the first chapter in that book is on how the Quran is a shafi'. There's shafa'ah of the Quran. It'll be an intercessor on the Day of Judgment, but only for those who have connected with it. The first hadith I'll share with you is from Imam Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Baqir alayhi as-salam. He quotes this from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. Where Rasulullah says, Ana awwalu wafidin ala al-aziz al-jabbari yawm al-qiyamah. I will be the first to enter into the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment. Wa kitabuhu or kitabahu wa ahla bayti thumma ummati. Along with, second, the book of God, third, my Ahlul Bayt, and then finally, my entire ummah. So all of us will be there on the Day of Judgment. Rasulullah first, the Book of God, his Ahlul Bayt, and then the rest of us. ثُمَّ أَسْأَلُهُمْ مَا فَعَلْتُ بِكِتَابِ اللَّهِ وَبِأَهْلِ بَيْتِي. Then Rasulullah will turn to his ummah and ask us, what did you do? What was your relationship with the Book of God and the Ahlul Bayt? We're accountable for both. We have to make that connection with both. And it can't be, well, as superficial as the connection is, that's how meaningful it is. Right? It's a factor of how deep the connection is. If I know something superficial about Ahlul Bayt, but don't know anything about who they are, what their teachings are, if I haven't made any effort to follow in their footsteps, to live a life that has some similarity to their life, then my relationship is very superficial, and that's not going to have much of any effect for my real life in the hereafter. And same with Kitabullah. If I've only memorized 3 surahs, the shortest I could find, so that I could be most efficient in my prayers, and I've never made efforts to memorize, I've never made efforts to try to understand the words, I've never read a translation, I've never made an effort to study it, then my connection to Quran is also very minimal. On the Day of Judgment, we aren't able to fake anything. If Rasulullah asks us, what was our relationship with these two? We can't pay lip service and say, yes, we were very devoted, we did a lot. Whatever's true is what can be said. We can't lie. So that should be a wake-up call, that we'll have to answer to Rasulullah. What do we do with the Thaqalain? Were we really people who stuck with the Thaqalain and stayed with them and found guidance through both? Or do we take one and abandon the other, or God forbid, abandon both? Another tradition I'll share with you, also in the same chapter of the same book. This one also is from Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam. And he is quoting from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. إِنَّ الدَّوَاوِينَ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ ثَلَاثَةٌ. So he tells us that these books of record, these ledgers, will be 3 on the Day of Judgment. دِيوَانٌ فِيهِ نِعَمُ اللَّهِ وَدِيوَانٌ فِيهِ الْحَسَنَاتِ فَتَسْتَغْرِقُ النِّعَمَ عَامَّةُ الْحَسَنَاتِ. No, it should be the other way. فَتَسْتَغْرِقُ النِّعَمُ عَامَّةَ الْحَسَنَاتِ. So he says that 2 of these ledgers, one is a ledger that records all of the blessings that Allah gave you. All the ni'am that Allah gave you. The second of the 3 ledgers is a record of all of the good deeds that you did with those blessings that He gave you. All right, so one is the capital that He's put in your hand, and one is what you've done with that capital, the good deeds that you were able to do with the blessings He gave. But he says that the blessings that Allah gives that ledger will swallow up the ledger of our good deeds. Why? Because وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. The blessings of Allah are infinite. We can't even enumerate the blessings that He's given us, the capital He's put in our hands. The good deeds that we do will never live up to the standard of the blessings that He's given us. We can never do enough to thank Him. We can never do enough to fully fulfill the gratitude and the appropriate action with those blessings that He's put in our hands. So we're left with liability. The blessings that have come with not enough hasanat to make up for that. وَيَبْقَى دِيوَانُ السَّيِّئَاتِ. The third of the 3 ledgers is the ledger that contains all of our bad deeds, all of our sins. So that puts us that's the reality call. Right? The reality check is that this is our state on the Day of Judgment by ourselves. فَيُدْعَى بِابْنِ آدَمَ الْمُؤْمِنِ لِلْحِسَابِ فَيَتَقَدَّمُ الْقُرْآنَ أَمَامَهُ فِي أَحْسَنِ الصُّورَةِ. A man will be called, a believer who believed in Islam and the Quran will be called forward. The Quran will walk in front of that man in the most beautiful form as his intercessor. And he'll say, Ya Rabbi, ana al-Quran. That Quran walking in front of us will say, I'm the Quran. وَهَذَا عَبْدُكَ الْمُؤْمِنْ قَدْ كَانَ يُتْعِبُ نَفْسَهُ بِتِلَاوَتِي. And this, the one walking behind me, is your believing servant who used to tire himself out, exhaust himself in reciting me. وَيُطِيلُ لَيْلَهُ بِتَرْتِيلِي. He used to spend long hours at night reciting me. وَتَفِيضُ عَيْنَاهُ إِذَا تَهَجَّدَ. And when he would stay up at night doing tahajjud, salatul layl, his eyes would well up with tears as he read me. فَأَرْضِهِ كَمَا أَرْضَانِي. So, O Allah, give him pleasure as he gave me pleasure. Satisfy him as he satisfied me. He fulfilled his right towards me. So now Allah, aside from the ledgers that are not in his favor, that are against him, right? With my intercession, because of his relationship with me, satisfy him the way he satisfied me. أَرْضِهِ كَمَا أَرْضَانِي. فَيَقُولُ الْعَزِيزُ الْجَبَّارُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, عَبْدِي أُبْسُطْ يَمِينَكَ فَيَمْلَأُهَا مِنْ رِضْوَانِ اللَّهِ الْعَزِيزُ الْجَبَّارُ. Allah will tell that servant to stretch out his right hand and open his hand, and Allah will fill the person's hand with Allah's ridwan, His pleasure. Whatever that means, but He'll give us the capacity that we can have of His pleasure in the right hand. And He'll say, stretch out your left hand, وَيَمْلَأُ شِمَالَهُ مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. He'll fill the mercy of God in our left hand. ثُمَّ يُقَالُ هَذِهِ الْجَنَّةِ مُبَاحَةٌ لَكَ. This Jannah, He'll say, is all open to you. Wherever you want to go, go. فَقْرَأْ وَاسْعَدْ. Sometimes it comes فَقْرَأْ وَرْقَةٌ. Read, and as you read, advance. The stations of paradise, it's not just a matter of getting in, but then there's stations within paradise, and we can attain those stations of paradise as a factor of the amount of connection we have with Quran. So the more I know of Quran, the more I've read, the more I've memorized, the more I've understood, the more I've acted, all of those levels of connection with Quran will affect my level, my station of paradise. So he says, here's paradise, it's all free for you, but waqra was'ad. Read and advance, rise in your station. فَإِذَا قَرَأَ آيَةً صَعِدَ دَرَجَةً. As he reads a verse, as he recites a verse that he had memorized before, that he acted on, that he understood, that all of that, they had that connection to, then he can advance to higher and higher stations in paradise. So 2 hadith of many that give us a wake-up call, both to warn us and then also to give us some incentive to maintain this connection, build this connection in a stronger and stronger way. So it's not superficial, not neglectful. Allah shouldn't be able to say that we've been negligent with Quran. Rasulullah shouldn't have to say that we're negligent with Quran, but rather He should see that we've made whatever efforts we could, and throughout our life we deepen that connection. Just one indication, one reality that I notice in our communities is that we put a lot of emphasis as we're parents, and we have kind of the power to be able to control our children's lives when they're very young. At that time, we put a lot of effort to making sure that they learn how to read Quran, for instance. In the Indian Pakistani community, we tend to be a lot better than, for instance, Arab communities. Arab communities, what I've noticed is that their kids maybe are teenagers and they haven't even learned how to read Arabic yet. Whereas in the Urdu-speaking that background, it's a higher priority, and so in a young age, typically, children learn how to read Quran because the parents are there and they find a teacher if they can't teach them themselves, and they put the emphasis on them. Until they're 7, 8, 10 years old, and they've done this Ameen kind of ceremony to say, okay, he's finished one cycle of Quran, she's finished one cycle of Quran, and then that tends to be the end. And then you fast forward 50 years, the person's 60 years old now, and the level of recitation of Quran, the kind of pronunciation, the kind of mistakes they make is no different from how he was doing it 50 years ago when he was 10. There's almost no advancement. The kind of adhan we give, it's the same childish adhan that we gave when we were 10 years old. The kind of Quran we recite, it still sounds like that little 10-year-old kid struggling with harakat and not able to differentiate between a dad and a dha and a zai and a dhal. It's all غَيْرَ الْمَغْزُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ. And the same kind of recitation that you mislearned when you were a kid, you're still saying that when you're 60. That can't be. How can we even argue before Allah that we made some effort to try to connect with Quran? That's just a superficial, just pronunciation, which is the easiest, most superficial level of connection with the Quran. And if we've been that negligent with even that, then what about the actual meaning of the Quran, the content of the Quran? بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد والثناء لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيبي إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل وسلم على رسولك محمد وعلى علي وفاطمة والحسن والحسين وعلي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن الحسن القائم المهدي صلوات الله عليهم أجمعين. Once again, in the second khutbah, I commend all of us to taqwa. We try to foster taqwa within ourselves, to have this constant fear of God, inshallah. Let me give you some practical pointers for how to connect with Quran in ways that I think are very meaningful and practical and that kind of attainable for the average person. So, studying the Quran, even reading the Quran, of course, is a first step. It is a book, it must be read. There are different ways you can read the Quran. Right, so Arabic recitation beginning to end, that's one way, and that's great, there's thawab in it, and all of that is there, but you're not really connecting with it as a book. One very helpful way to read the Quran is to look into how the Quran was revealed historically. So we do have some ahadith that give us an indication of the tartibun nuzul, the sequence in which the Quran was revealed. The sequence of surahs that we now have was a later development. In the time of Uthman, they arranged these surahs in this particular order, from basically longest to shortest. Now, that's not the way that the Quran was revealed when it was revealed to Rasulullah. So the first surah that was revealed is Surah Al-Alaq, which is in the 30th juz. Right? Not Fatiha, not Baqarah. So one helpful way to read the Quran is to read it at least one time in the sequence that historically it was revealed. And especially if you can read that alongside a seerah, history of the Prophet's life, then you start to see things and understand things that are different from if you just read it from beginning to end, from Fatiha to Nas. Now, I'm not saying that it should be like that or we should always read it like that, but as an experience, as one study, one cycle of Quran, read it in that sequence. And you'll see insights that you never understood before. Because now you're seeing the history of Islam as it's unfolding in the life of the Prophet. You see the Meccan period separately and the Medinan period separately. You see how these battles are taking place, and you see that there are verses that are related to those battles. You see different experiences. What are the challenges in Mecca? What are the challenges in Medina? How are they different? And it really gives you some insight into the Quran and into the connection with the Prophet himself. If you want a sequence or kind of a list of the surahs in Tartibun Nuzul, so Allama Tabatabai wrote a book at the request of Sayyid Hussain Nasr back in the probably 60s or 70s, maybe earlier, called, it's been translated as Quran in Islam. So in Quran in Islam, he has a list of all the surahs, as they were revealed, based on this one hadith of Ibn Abbas. So don't take it as a foolproof, mistake-free list. There's discussion. Some of the surahs, scholars have discussion whether it was revealed this early or maybe later. All that's aside. But it's still a very useful tool to read through the Quran once like that. Another good way to read Quran as one course of study is to look at the stories. Right? So my God's Emissaries is an effort to bring all the verses around a particular prophet, bring them together and put it into a narrative. So if you're to read a chapter of God's Emissaries, right, have a full picture of what the story of Prophet Musa is from beginning to end, with understanding, with commentary, all of that's in the book. And then as you read through Quran and you come across those verses, now you have some context. You know that, this particular incident where he's pulling his hand out of his clothing and it's white, I understand where that happened. It happened once when he met Allah at the mountain of Tur. It happened again when he was in the court of Pharaoh. You have the context of the story, so you know where that particular verse and that particular miracle happened in the context of the bigger story. So it adds this kind of insight. Now you have a great tool in your pocket to be able to understand every one of those verses in Quran that relates to that prophet. Another way to connect with Quran is to memorize. This is another thing that we consign and say, the Sunnis, they memorize Quran, they do Taraweeh prayers, and we take the bid'ah of Taraweeh prayers as an excuse for us not to memorize Quran. It's a twisted kind of logic that we use to justify our own inability or our own lack of motivation to memorize. Memorizing Quran should be a standard part of our education. Maybe not all of it, but there should be a concerted effort, and it should be a progression through our life. And not that you memorize 5 surahs when you were 10 years old and you haven't memorized anything since. So memorization doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. Right? One really useful way to engage with memorization is to memorize those verses that are very commonly recited. One thing that Shia are strong in is attending majalis and lectures. They may not read Quran much, they may not read enough, they may not do other things, but at least majalis and speeches and these kinds of things, that's one very kind of a vibrant part of our Islamic life. So the scholars who are sharing information with you, oftentimes they'll base their discussion on a verse of Quran. And sometimes you'll have maybe a whole 10 series of 10 lectures in a series all about one verse. What a shame if after hearing that verse and hearing discussions on that verse for 10 days, you can't even recall the verse. You've never once opened the Quran to find that verse in your own Quran and see where it is, which surah it's in, where is it on the page, read the translation, after listening to lectures about it for 10 days. Now what's the point? What's the point in all those lectures if you can't even remember that one verse that was repeated over and over again in every lecture? Right? So start with the verses that are most dear to you, those verses that are clearly about Ahlul Bayt. Like Ayatul Tathir and Ayatul Mubahala and Ayatul Wilaya and Ayatul Nur and all these different verses that we hear so much recited through these speeches. If you don't know what those verses are, if you can't recite them from memory, if you don't know what surah they're in, how to find them in the Quran, then again, what's the point in all those majalis and lectures that you've listened to? Right, so that's the place to start. Because not every verse in Quran is of the same caliber. There's some that are more poetic and more memorable, and really they just stick with you. And others are repeated, and maybe they're not as memorable and as powerful. They serve their role in other ways. But start with those that are memorable, those that are significant, those that have been repeated to you a lot, that you've read a lot, that you've heard a lot. At least memorize those. And keep a running list. So it's not just a matter of you've memorized it now, you don't have a record of what you've memorized. Have some sort of a tool. Make a list of all the verses you've memorized. Now with devices, if you have a Quran app, you can bookmark those verses that you've memorized, highlight them. It'll keep a list, and then when you want to review, you can just go through your list and review yourself or ask someone else to test you and that sort of a thing. But then you have a progression in your memorization, where over the years there's more and more, and now when you're 60 years old, you have so much of the Quran memorized because you've made that effort to do that. Recite one salawat ala Muhammad wa alayhi. All right. Another tip to keep in mind is to make an effort to learn Arabic. Don't let it just be that red sulfur that you're always after and you spend your life and you've never successfully been able to do anything with learning Arabic. Now, learning Arabic also doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. There are many tools, many programs that will help you to learn enough Arabic to be able to make sense of things. Maybe your goal doesn't have to be to learn Arabic, with all of its grammar in such a way that you can independently read the Quranic text or some other Arabic book. That doesn't have to be the goal. That's a very lofty goal, and it takes a lot of concerted effort and a lot of study and a lot of work to get to that level of proficiency. But there are people among you, I've met some of you, you've just made an effort, you've read Quran over the years with some concerted effort, with a translation by its side, and you've made a comparison. You've seen, this is the verse, here's the translation. I can match up these words. I see that, this word is mentioned very much in the Quran, and I can see it's translated in this way, and you learn vocabulary over time. Simple sentence structures, you learn pronouns and dhalika and huwa and hadha and these kinds of things, so you understand what they mean, and you can once you see the translation, at least you can see how that translation comes from this verse. You may not be able to write your own translation and understand it and analyze the Arabic independently, but at very least, once you have the translation in front of you, you should be able to connect backwards and say that I can see how this translation comes from this verse. I can see the common words, I can see some common sentence structures that I know, and I can make sense of it. That's a very attainable goal for every single one of us. It takes some work, but it's just normal kind of casual study in a little bit of concerted way, a little bit regular way, and you can make such great strides in understanding Quran. One of the things that I think is maybe a fear factor for Shia is that we are afraid of doing something like tafsir bil ra'i. When you read Quran, it shouldn't be passive either. You read it, you read a translation, you read commentary, that's all kind of, there's some active role in reading, but you're also just understanding what someone else has said. But at some point, you also need to be able to express your own opinion and say, I think this is what the verse is saying. Once I've read the commentary, once I've looked through the translation, I've tried to struggle with the verse, I should be able to step back and say, I think this is what the verse is saying. At least we should take that much ownership of the meaning of the Quran. But I think sometimes as Shia, we're scared to even say that because we worry, what if I say something that's wrong? What if I say the meaning of the Quran and it's not the right meaning? That kind of fear should not stop us from studying. Tafsir bil ra'i, kind of understanding Quran, imposing a meaning on the Quran that's from my mind, rather than trying to understand what the Quran is saying, telling the Quran what it's saying. That takes a level of arrogance, right? If you have humility when you come to the Quran, you study it, you're trying to understand it. There's one time when I come away from the verse, I say, definitely God is saying such and such. And I with a conclusive voice, a conclusive attitude, I say, this is what the verse is saying, nobody can tell me different. Clearly, that's an arrogant that's an arrogant attitude to have. But if I simply say, this is what I understand from the verse, that's a provisional understanding. I understand that this is what I've understood as of today with whatever work I've done, and now that becomes my provisional understanding of the verse. What's wrong with that? That's excellent. And now you go forward in life with that provisional understanding of the verse, and next time you engage with the verse, you have a discussion, you hear a speech that deals with the verse, you see that scholar is saying something that challenges your provisional understanding. Excellent. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now you've done the legwork, you've gotten yourself to a point where you had enough understanding of the verse to be able to come up with a provisional understanding. You had a prepared mind as you engage with that lecture, with that book, with that discussion. And if that person has a convincing argument that debunks your provisional understanding, excellent. Now you revise your understanding and you come to the next level. Okay, I thought it was this. Now I see I was wrong for this reason or that reason. Here's my new understanding of the verse. All of that is wonderful. That's exactly how we're supposed to progress with the Quran and any book, any course of study. So we shouldn't, that fear of somehow imposing meaning on Quran or making a claim that I have no right to make, those are things that we should put out of our mind. If you come with humility and whatever conclusion you come away with, you understand it's provisional, it's the best I could do until now, based on what I understand, this is what I understand. There's nothing, absolutely, Allah's not going to blame you. He'll praise you for having studied the Quran to the best of your ability. And it'll develop over time. And ideally, it should never stop developing. The greatest ulama, the commentators of Quran, even after they write their tafsir, that's not the end of their journey with Quran. They're still, sometimes they write multiple tafsir. Right, Allama Tabrisi, he wrote Majma' al-Bayan. He wrote Majma' al-Bayan, lengthy commentary, and usually 10 volumes is how it's published. And then after he finished, he found out that on the other side in Mecca, there is this Zamakhshari, a Mu'tazili scholar, who wrote Al-Kashaf at the same time. But he wrote his Kashaf contemporaneously with Majma' al-Bayan, so he wasn't able to engage with the ideas and respond to it or incorporate any of the ideas from this Zamakhshari. So he left that. When he finished his Majma' al-Bayan, that was done. He started another tafsir just to engage with that one tafsir from across the world in Mecca and read that, engage with it, critique it, affirm it, connect it with Ahlul Bayt, and so all of this. He wrote another tafsir. It's a common thing for our commentators of Quran, our scholars, until they're dead, they are still engaging in new ways with Quran and still understanding new things from it. So certainly at our level, we should expect the same, that our learning curve actually should be much greater because we have so much more to learn. But that only happens if we engage. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, we ask you to forgive the believers, alive and dead, those who are with us, those who are not. We ask you to guide us in this month of Quran to the Quran. Allah, let us not be amongst those who neglect either Ahlul Bayt or the Quran. Let us be among those who hold fast to both and inshallah join with Rasulullah, having both next to us as our intercessors. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Salatul Jumu'ah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la